Good evening, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you are connecting. Welcome to the 9th session of the World University Summit. The session is titled Jumping Hurdles, Empowering First-Generation Learners in Higher Education. We have 4 distinguished speakers for this session. Let me briefly introduce them. Professor Dr. MALISH, Assistant Professor at Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay. Professor Lisa Phillips, Professor and Vice President Academic, York University. Professor Dr. Ian Pickup, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Students at the Open University, United Kingdom. Professor Dr. NIDHI S. SABHARWAL, Associate Professor, Center for Policy Research in Higher Education, National Institute of Education, Planning and Administration, Delhi, India. I take this opportunity to warmly welcome all the distinguished panelists to this panel. The panel will deliberate on the discourse of inclusion with regard to first-generation learners. Literature, education literature is abundant on discourses on first-generation lawyers, first-generation doctors. They generally belong to, a lineage is required in order to thrive, in order to flourish under the shades of a certain tree, which the lineage creates. However, that's not the case with the first-generation learners. The concept is complex, the idea is complex, and providing inclusion to the first-generation learners is even complex. Now, the complexity is manifested in different forms. When I say first-generation learners, a lot of concepts come to the mind. Number one, underprivileged. People who are deprived of something, people who are from the peripheries, people who have undergone struggles, social justice, and also equal opportunities. So in this complexity of the concepts, first thing we need to do is to identify who are the first generation of the lawyers before we even go and talk about what kind of support systems could be provided them by way of their inclusion in institutions. Now, the first generation learners could also be socially underprivileged and economically underprivileged. They could be economically privileged, but socially underprivileged. So understanding who all will fit into the category of first-generation lawyers is the first challenge. Well, most of the higher educational institutions today are conscious of the need for inclusion and diversity. Both are high values which institutions cherish. Most of the admissions officers of the institutions make certain that they follow a policy of inclusion, what I would call as sociology of admissions. However, things don't end there. Admissions office can only strike the essential diversity. They can only provide the essential inclusion. The real inclusion will manifest through the practices, through the policies of the educational institutions. So that means once the admissions office, strictly in adherence to the sociology of admissions, have created the essential diversity, there is a bigger responsibility upon the educational institutions. So this panel will primarily deliberate upon this responsibility of the institutions. Of course, I first of all invite all the speakers to broadly reflect on this theme, first-generation learners, from whatever perspectives they choose, because we have here distinguished panelists from different backgrounds, after which I'll have a couple of questions to them. So first of all, let me invite Professor Lisa Phillips to speak. Over to you, Professor Phillips.
Well, thank you so kindly. It's really an honor to be asked to join this panel and to learn from all of these distinguished panelists. For those who may not know us, York University is the 3rd largest university in Canada. We have over 50,000 students from over 170 countries around the world. In Toronto, which is a magnet for people all around the world, and so that we benefit from tremendous diversity. Over 16,000 of our current 50,000 students are first-generation university goers. So this has been part of our mission from the beginning when we were founded in the mid-20th century, providing access to a very broad demographic of students to a research-intensive, high-quality university education. So we actually ask our first-generation learners to self-identify. So that is how we overcome that barrier of the sociology of admissions that you're referring to. And we have some specific awards, financial awards, that I think not only provide material support, but also a signaling effect to communicate to students out there that actually we're looking for you, precisely for you, students with high potential who may have faced many different kinds of barriers, who may not have thought of themselves as university students, We make a real point of going and speaking with students who are still in school, so well before they're at the point of considering university or what comes after high school, to get the idea planted in their minds that they too could go to university. And we talk to them about all sorts of things, but including the fact that we have a special scholarship for first-generation students. We also created in 2017 a program that was the first of its kind in Canada called the Sanctuary Scholars Program, which is an admissions pathway specifically for students who are in Canada but have precarious immigration status. In other words, they may come from a family who is in the middle of a refugee claim and does not yet have settled immigration status in Canada. This could be a barrier to studying, but we have a special pathway for them. I'm very excited about an award we launched just 2 years ago called the Tentanda Via Award. Tentanda Via means, for those who are rusty on their Latin, it means the way must be tried, and it's York University's motto. And this is designed specifically for international students who have overcome barriers to attend university. And it's a larger award designed to bring students, many of them are first generation, who come through that award. So we try to really make it very clear, you do belong at York University. After the students arrive, there's a very broad suite of supports that we have, but one of them that's targeted specifically to first generation students is to have a first generation reception where students are invited to bring their families to our campus and who can meet each other, form a network, hear from many of the leaders and professors at the university who themselves were first generation university goers, and to try to really create that sense that if you have questions about whether you belong here, you need to move beyond that, because you absolutely have been sought out by us precisely because of our mission. I believe I'm going to stop there for now. I did just want to congratulate Jindal Global University on being the host for next year's API conference, the Asia Pacific Education Conference. That is wonderful news, and I hope that I'll be able to join you there next March.
Thank you, Professor Phillips. I mean, while you were speaking, I was thinking about this fact that education is also a public good. And when we talk about first generation lawyers, that means, of course, generational injustice. There is a generation, or there are generations who could not go to educational institution despite education being a public good. Of course, when we come later on to specific questions, I would like to know a little more about this process of self-identification, which is absolutely a very interesting process. So may I now invite Professor MALISH to speak his perspectives. Over to you, Professor MALISH.
Well, thank you, Professor SREEJITH. So first, let me take this opportunity to appreciate Jindal Global University for your initiative for bringing together scholars from the different part of the world and discuss about the first generation learner. And if you, in the recent past, actually, we have seen a massive expansion of higher education across the globe. And maybe in the post-2000, much of those expansion actually taken place in so-called third world countries, because there's already the developed countries like the OECD has already reached optimal levels of educational expansion. So much of the expansion, what we have been seeing now after 2000 is mainly from the other less developed or developing within inverted comma countries. India is a classic example for that. And India, one thing we could see that India's massive expansion of higher education by the first or second decade of this millennium, the primarily was led by the social demand for higher education than the economic demand for the skill. It's clearly visible in the nature of our enrollment in the different kind of discipline and the changing discourse in India regarding from employment to employability. So my issue in India, there is no concept in a policy discourse called a first generation learner. We continue to discuss about the disadvantage due to the caste, ethnicity, minority status, gender, and differently able. FGL is not an important policy category in India, unlike other countries. And only recently we have included economically weaker section also. So we could not broaden the scope of the disadvantage in higher education in one way. Then today we discuss about the idea of empowering the first generation learner. So our primary concern or assumption is that educational status of the family determines the outcome of the students. So there is an inherent implicit assumption. So we need to unpack this assumption. So we have to ask the first question, who are those first generation learner? Because first generation learner alone may not be making much changes in the student life. First generation status, when intersect with other identities like the caste, class, etc., that makes a huge difference. So if you're only looking at the FGL, there is a serious issue. And second, and we need more evidence also in India how FGL status intersect with the other kind of identity and shaping the student experience and the student outcome. Secondly, what exactly determines student life, particularly among the first generation learner? Is it the academic competency or the pre-college credential they bring into the college? Or is it because is it their social and cultural background? So what is the actual determinant actually shaping the educational experience of the students belong to first generation learner? And thirdly, who needs to be ready? Is the student should be ready for college, or college should be ready to receive or welcome the first generation learner? Maybe the title also, we are talking about empowering the students. I think we need to think about our transforming our institution for welcoming and receiving students from the diverse background. So I will stop here. I will come to the other points later.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Malish. I agree with your point that you cannot discuss a topic like, especially in a third world, you cannot discuss a topic like first generation lawyer with a certain comfort, because of course there will be a deep sense of apologism. Because in 21st century we are talking about first generation lawyers in a country which aspires to be a global power. So I'm sure this is a good problematic in that sense, that this kind of a discourse is a good problematic. And as I mentioned, that this is a big social question, that why you still have first generation lawyers. That means that there have been some amount of injustice. I'll come to the rest of the your points during the detailed questions later on. So may I invite Professor SABHARWAL to provide her perspective.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be a part of this panel. In my opening remarks, I will begin with quickly highlighting the massifying context of higher education in India and its key features, which have implications on many of the equity dimensions concerning first-generation higher education learners. Three key features define the context of higher education in India today. One, higher education in India has traditionally been an exclusive domain of the elite, entered a stage of massification in this century. Between 2000 and 22, student enrollment increased from 9.95 million to 41.3 million students. The number of students enrolled increased 4 times, making it the second largest higher education system in the world. Student diversity, before that, the expansion of the higher education is being fueled by the private sector and financed by the household. Close to 78% of colleges are privately managed, and the sector accounts for 66% of the total enrollment. Student diversity is an important aspect of the expansion of higher education, with access to higher education improving across all segments of population, including first-generation higher education learners. Favorable public policies at the school level, example, Education for All programs, the Right to Education Act, resulted in availability of larger number of graduates from the secondary level eligible for pursuing higher education. Now, at the higher education level, affirmative action at the entry level has improved access to students from traditionally underrepresented backgrounds, with first generation higher education learners constituting a significant share of the undergraduate population in the public higher education institutions. Estimates from large-scale studies at the CPRHE suggest 25% of the undergraduate students have parents with no post-secondary education. Some studies have also estimated this share to be 50%, and from the national sample survey data sets. If we even have conservative estimates in numbers, these suggest at least 10.25 million first-gen students in higher education in India. Now, identities of first-gen are often intersectional. According to CPRHE study, first-gens are more likely to come from wage labor households, belong to minoritized religious, social, and ethnic groups, such as the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and reside in rural areas. In addition, they are more likely to have studied in under-resourced government schools, in regional languages as medium of instruction, and exposed to outdated syllabi, making the transition to college level studies difficult. Now, while more first-gen students from diverse social backgrounds in India are going to college than ever before because of the favorable public policies, emerging evidence raises equity concerns around students' college preparedness, the college readiness. And I'm leading a large-scale study on the college readiness in higher education in India at the CPRHE. Now, equity concerns include, one, first gens who are more likely to be from the SCDGs, the socially and economically disadvantaged groups, facing considerable obstacles in accessing technical and professional subjects, more often offered by the private institutions. And this is a result of socio-economic barriers to academic preparation required for test-based admissions in institutions offering these high-value subjects. And two, inequalities in the level of college readiness skills to persist in their college level educational goals and achieve academic success. Now, college readiness indicates students' capacity to engage, one, in college search activities, two, enroll in post-secondary institution, three, take college level coursework, including achieving grades, and possess aspirations, motivation, and self-efficacy to persist in achieving one's educational goals. Now, such dimensions of college preparation usually begins early in the education process for students from privileged backgrounds in India. Now, how first-gen students are empowered by their institutions will depend on, one, what constitutes merit for admissions by higher education institutions, moving away from that deficit ideology. Two, how inequalities in opportunities for college preparations are taken into account in accessing higher education. And three, the important role of affirmative action for first-gen students from socially and economically disadvantaged groups for inclusion, for social inclusion in higher education institutions. So I will stop here with my opening remarks, and I'll come back to all these 3 points further into the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor SABHARWAL. The data has been extremely useful. It at least confirms the point. It confirms the point which we have been trying to prove, and I'm sure that most of the propositions made by Professor MALISH, your data proves those propositions. So anyway, we'll move forward. We'll hear from Professor Pickup, and after that, we'll get a little detail. We'll get into the details of the problem. Over to you, Professor Pickup.
Well, good evening, and it's a real pleasure to be with you here from the UK and to join such a great panel. And I've certainly enjoyed the insights that my colleagues here have provided so far today. I'm here at the Open University in the United Kingdom. We've been around since 1969, and funnily enough, so have I since 1969, not always at the Open University. At the Open University, we have around 200,000 learners across a range of courses and pathways. And our mission is to be open to people, places, methods, and ideas. So we're pretty distinctive, certainly in the UK sector, as a leading provider of open distance education, predominantly part-time education to that end. I've been with the OU just since last April, having spent the other decades of my career in higher education at face-to-face campuses. But I've always majored on the student experience. And my role as Vice-Chancellor of Students is absolutely centered on the outcomes for our students, outcomes from the student perspective, aligned to their motivations and their interests, but also outcomes from our regulatory perspective. And here in the UK, we have lots of interest from our government and regulatory body around the outcomes that our students go on to achieve, both in terms of qualifications and their jobs they go on to, but also in terms of the outcomes during their journey, their learning journey, continuation and completion, for example. So that is much of my focus for all of our very diverse group of learners. Just by way of interest, out of our approximately 200,000 learners, over 35,000 of our learners are thought to be first generation learners for the purpose of this conversation. At least those are the students who have told us they are. Back to that earlier question about how do we know? Well, we ask them at enrollment to declare whether they have parents or their carers who have also been to university. And of course, some of our students may not either know or might not choose to disclose that. It's an obvious thing to say, but our learners are also across the lifespan. So of course, some of our older learners may be a long way removed in terms of that temporal dimension of their previous generation, if that makes sense. I was a first generation learner myself, back in a different century, let's say, but certainly with the benefit of hindsight, looking back on my time as an undergraduate in the late 1980s, I can understand the importance of learning to be a student and the impact of socioeconomic background on one's own experience, and components of my own undergraduate experience that related to identity formation, my own evolving sense of social capital. I guess it's what I now know to be social capital. I wouldn't have known that as the 18-year-old self. My confidence and my motivation, including my choice of course. And we know that socioeconomic background and by implication, whether you're first generation or not, can impact on your aspiration and your choice of course at the very outset on leaving high school. The world has changed a lot since the late 1980s. And the first generation definition is what I find difficult. It's problematic. And we know from our own work here in the sector in the UK that it can mask a range of other more specific and intersectional characteristics at a personal, at a demographic, at an ethnicity, at a social class, at a household income level, as well as geographic location in the UK. And the UK is now more stratified on a social basis than it ever has been in the past. And so we do know we have regional inequalities, and we have a significant range of household income, for example, that our students present with. We have increasing poverty rates in the United Kingdom, fairly well reported in that sense. So of course, all of those things do intersect. And we do know that the students at the Open University who are at most at risk of not continuing, put another way, the students at most risk of withdrawing from their studies have a number of intersecting characteristics, which include being part of the lower socioeconomic group in each of our 4 nations in the United Kingdom. Part of the world changing has seen the increased massification that's already been referenced by my previous panelists. But To be a first in family student, first generation student, we now know that around 2/3 of our youngest graduates, those who have completed in the UK, would now be classified as first in family, first generation learners, which is a great thing. So we have seen in our sector, our HE sector in the UK, marked progress. However, I would contend that much of the heavy lifting in that regard has been done by certain types of institution. What we might term the less elite, academically elite institutions, what we call locally in the UK, the post-92 institutions, former polytechnic institutions, which may have also a greater, historically, a greater focus on vocational and technical education. Remember, I said earlier, my own choice of university course, I think was partly driven by my interest in the subject, first of all, but also a focus from my own background on future labour market and where I thought I would have the best return on my investment in time at that stage. We do see the greatest impact on social mobility rates in the UK sector are amongst those institutions that are those modern post-92 institutions, where we see the greatest increase in numbers of first generation students being successful, both in terms of access at enrolment, but also through their continuation. So into the practicalities, we also see first and family students, and by way of proxy, we might call them working class students in UK terminology. And we know from a number of research studies, I'll point you to the work of Diane Ray, published in 2018, that use the term outsiders on the inside. So in terms of students from our lower socioeconomic groups, their experiences once at university, particularly those that are able to access the more elite Russell Group, you may have heard that term, institutions in the UK, they have a different experience to their more affluent colleagues and peers, who will include those from families who are well experienced in the field of higher education. And so there are barriers within a student journey that we know exist, that are real, that are problematic, even where a student has accessed the institution and it has begun their studies. Recognizing all of that, at the Open University, we place a great importance on three broad factors: a student's motivation to study, which is partly what will drive their choice of course; their confidence to study, which will be impacted by their prior educational experience; and their readiness to study. And by readiness to study, I would point to their academic skills, their academic readiness, to understand how to learn, to have the skills ready to research, to write, to be numerate, and so on at the right level. But we also recognize that because of the range of learners that we admit, remember, open is in the title, so we don't have any entry requirements for our undergraduate courses. We have a significant range. So someone could be in a class at the first level of study who's already got a PhD, but going back to study a new subject, and someone else might have been a school leaver age 16 without high school diplomas, coming back into education some years down the line later in life. So our range of student support needs is not insignificant. And so placing a focus on those three areas means that we have to focus on early experiences. So, induction and orientation would be important everywhere, but in particular for all of our students, we endeavour to ensure that they have the right information early. They can engage really early with the tools of the trade, with being a student at the earliest possible moment, and that we have a lot of support front-loaded into the first study experiences to that end. One final word, because I know I'm probably in danger of eating into all of my time, is to note the importance of what we could call elsewhere in a face-to-face institution, the extracurricular and the co-curricular. I know from my own experience that part of my social capital was evolved outside of the classroom in a campus environment. Now, there's a real risk here. And just by providing more to already busy, time-pressured students who are perhaps struggling at times to learn to become a student isn't necessarily the answer that we hope it will be. So real cognizance of time pressure on all of our students potentially juggling academic study with part-time work alongside caring and family commitments is really important. So embedding the development of social skills, for example, within the curriculum, I think is a really important step to take, or at the very least ensuring that the times for the co-curricular, extracurricular activities aren't always at the wrong time for many students. So for example, for our students, something is scheduled to be delivered at the school pickup time when students might be going to collect their own children from school would be an impossible thing to attend. So having different times across the week, something as simple as that, to make sure that our activities are accessible, are really important practical steps to ensure that we're ready for the student as much as the student is ready for us, to coin an earlier phrase. I shall close there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pickett. I think open university is the very answer to the question on first generation learners. I mean, if we take the organic idea of an open university, and also it sends a message, their presence send a message that, you know, we care. We do empower, but of course we understand that open university is not an end, it's just a beginning, or probably, you know, a beginning for the students to advance further. We really do not know whether we could consider education in an open university as addressing the problem of the first generation lawyers or not. We'll come back to this very, very soon. Now, let me have a question to each one of you. I'll go into a little deeper into the sociology of admissions. Professor Phillips, you spoke about self-identification, well, which is one way to identify who are the first generation lawyers. Barring this, are there ways actually for the law school or the university admissions officers to understand who is a first generation learner or who is not? Because this is not an easily discernible class like caste or a gender. Well, caste also, of course, you know, many times you have to self-identify, or rather through declarations only that this is identified. So how do we ensure inclusion when admissions officers have been given the mandate that you have to, you know, approach with a high value of inclusion? They often struggle to identify who is going to be a first generation learner or not, because of the very fact that first generation learners are not a socially discernible class. Second one is, of course, for many, even accessibility is a big question. We are here talking about responsibility of higher educational institutions in creating a congenial atmosphere for the first generation learners. Apologies for being a law school dean, for the first generation learners. So many of them may not even be able to reach the higher educational institution. So I don't know whether we can also look at the society largely and to provide inclusion to them. I'm sure this is the larger responsibility of the admissions office. So I'll focus my question primarily on the identification. How do we identify and then, you know, give an entry by way of inclusion to the first generation learners? I'll start with Professor Phillips. We'll proceed in the same order.
Thank you so much, Dr. SREEJITH. I guess the first step might be to define what we mean by first generation. And so as Professor Pickup was mentioning, you know, the fact that neither of your parents attended university might be a more answerable question than, are you a first generation learner? Or attended higher education of any sort. So that may be helpful to students in actually realizing, oh, yes, that's me. Maybe that's part of why I'm not feeling completely confident about being in this place, or, you know, as comfortable as some of my peers are. You know, I think that government policy, public policy is incredibly important. And I really heard that in all of the comments, right? That there's something about government saying, you must track this. In Canada, in Ontario, the province where I am in Toronto, the province identified some time ago that we would need to have metrics on how many first generation learners we had as a key access metric because that was one of the province's goals, was actually to bring people into university, into college, who had not had parents who attended that, who might not immediately see that as the normal, natural path that they would take. And so we were required to come up with a system of self-identification and tracking and reporting. And in the UK, I've been very impressed from what I know about the outcomes tracking and reporting. We're not there yet in Canada in terms of knowing, well, okay, so you let students in, that's great. They had access to the institution, but did they complete? Were they able to persist? How long did that take them? I think one of the most troubling stories that for any of us who care about access to university can hear is that a student came in, their families spent funds on a university education, maybe they took on debt even to come to university, and that they didn't complete their credential, and that they left with a sense of failure or a sense of it wasn't really for me in the end, and that they didn't get that mobility effect of having a credential that gives them something to show to an employer. I think that is the most troubling sort of story. And so I actually think that it is probably appropriate for Canadian governments to start moving in the direction of outcomes tracking, as well as the incoming stats. I'm curious about whether India has moved in that direction at all as yet.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. You mentioned about the Indian context, and I would pose my question to Professor Malish exactly on that an Indian higher educational institution which is deeply committed to inclusion, how do they identify the first generation learners? Because many of the first generation lawyers, of course, the socioeconomic background itself is preventing them to be the first generation learners, yet a small number would come. But how could institutions identify them in the way we identify gender, we identify caste, and give an inclusion?
Yeah, this is partly a technical issue. For my understanding, in India, so why we need to identify these people? That's the first question. If our focus is to provide more admission, I think there is no need to worry about the identification of the FGL in India, because we are in a country like low education, particularly in higher education. So if we want to increase our gross enrollment ratio to 50% means simplicity, because without providing education to the large first generation learner, we will not be able to achieve that. So that for the admission stage, it's all of a kind of an automatic kind of a process. If you are able to increase our GR to 50%, automatically larger share will be coming from so-called first generation. So we can, the one way, the parents who did not undergo any kind of a higher education, either completed or successfully completed, so their children can be considered as so it is not it's a very technical issue. And for admission, I don't think something needs to be done intensively, because if you are aiming to achieve more gross enrollment ratio, this will be coming particularly from the so-called FGL category. So that's one point. And second, if you look at the history of equity provisions across the globe, one peculiar characteristic of FGL is that all other equity characteristics can be transferred from one generation to may be transferred from one generation to next generation. If any woman, that can be transferred to next generation. A scheduled caste, now a parent is a scheduled caste, his children also is a scheduled caste. But the FGL is a very peculiar kind of a status. Once you complete your degree, that disadvantage cannot be translated to the next generation, because automatically their children will be so that's one issue. And secondly, if you look at the history of education, for instance, the Harvard University established in 1636, but the first time African Americans entered into Harvard University only in 1960s. So there is traditionally a group has been denied the opportunity, then they came to the university system. But the FGL, by default, whoever joined higher education in the initial stage, all are FGL. It's not something new, because when the university system started in India in 1857, all who joined were first generation learner. So India's encounter with the FGL is not new. Not only India, anywhere in the world, the higher education's encounter with the FGL is not new, because this context is different because of the social context. When we talk about the 1870s, when the first college was established in Calcutta, or the first university established in 1857, that FGL belonged to a certain socially upper strata. So that FGL did not face much problem. Now we are talking about a different kind of FGL. They are not belonging to that upper social status. That is the sociology of admission. What I would like to elaborate what Moses SREEJITH has mentioned. So that is the hardcore questions of this FGL. Otherwise, our FGL debate actually conceal the actual problem that exists in the higher education system in India.
Well, that's a great point. I mean, this is what I stand with that. Do we really need to define and understand who are the FGL? Because you mentioned at some point, Professor MALISH, about the intersectionality here. Because now, of course, there is gender, caste, and of course, the social strata, which are easily discernible based on which the diversity is struck. Now, there could be intersectionality. There could be first-generation learners within them. So just a sub-question to you, that do you think too much of focus on FGL, the first-generation learners, would actually impact the intersectionality, which ultimately creates the intersectionality within the diversity, which is otherwise created by the universities?
This question for me?
No, a sub-question. Yeah, just a sub-question. You may respond in a few seconds.
FGL is one of the factors. The generational educational status of the family is the one of the factors. So we should give attention to that. So there is no need to intervene much at maybe at the admission, particularly in the Indian context. Maybe after the admission, and colleges and university can take a proactive role to identify who are those people whose parents did not undergo any kind of a higher education. Then we can try to devise some mechanism to provide whatever support system they need more. It's not necessarily that all the time they will be lacking. They may have their own strength, etc. We can strengthen that strength point. If something is additional required, the institution can provide. That is the way I will look into this FGL scenario.
Okay, that's an interesting question, interesting point. I mean, whether this poses a question whether educational institutions really need to look at the local communities, whether they literally need to look at the society to make sure that there is FGL, or there are FGL in the institution, or that they should focus more on their own institution to create the atmosphere more conducive for the FGL. We may get time to come back to this. I'll move to Professor SABHARWAL. From a policy perspective, I'm sure that you will be able to address this question, throwing more light on the facts.
So I think in terms of policy questions, so affirmative action and where, FGL status intersects with the SEDG statuses in the public institutions where affirmative action is applicable. There is a large private sector which is not mandated legally to implement affirmative action. And there, and in fact, even in public where it's selectivity, there I will say sociology of admissions will come into the picture. What constitutes merit in admissions by higher education institutions, especially elite institutions, both in the private and public. So when merit in admission is understood only as academic merit based on qualifying test scores, evidence shows that this is based on access to past resources and is most often affected by inherited class-based or gender-based privilege. Inherited privilege very often helps by achievements, with merit itself being determined by non-meritocratic factors such as social origin. This then means that focus of empowering first-generation learners needs to address complex combinations of social and epistemic dimensions of obstacles faced by them in accessing skills and knowledge that make them college ready. But when I say college ready, beyond students being college ready, institutional strategies which aim to ensure that colleges are ready to fully facilitate diverse learners to meet their academic potential irrespective of their background. Now, this is crucial for higher educations to act as a catalyst of social change when institutions are ready for students, first-gen students, because as indicated, the data, the analysis, empirical evidence shows that being first-gen college student is more than coming from a background where your parents did not graduate from college. It has intersectionality aspects to it. So in that context, it is important that affirmative actions democratize informed higher education decision-making and include a socially just conception of merit, which considers students' future potential of academic promise. Merit should be looked at more broadly for students from the first gen who are more likely to be also from socially and economically disadvantaged groups who demonstrate aspects of motivation, maturity, perseverance in their prior educational profile. So going beyond the test, the scores, it should be more on the future potential of academic promise. And in the context of the income support, financial support in the form of aids and grants as opposed to loans is also associated with higher rates of student retention, especially for students who are first generation and also from low income groups. One last thing I wanted to discuss is mention about women. Women who are from families with no generational knowledge of college going knowledge. It's gender conservatism that impacts their access to college and their choice of subject. So what affects their choice and access to higher education and choices, the distance to college and the safety of the higher education environment. That aspect becomes very important in the patriarchal sort of context that women in India are accessing higher education. Thank you.
Well, the last point you made is very interesting, actually. Even the geographical accessibility is a big factor in deciding their access to higher educational institution. So, Professor Pickup, I don't know how appropriate the same question is posed to you, because when you say open, whether your admissions should focus on first generation learners or not, the very idea of open in the open university, that of course this is a place where you will find a lot of first generation learners. Yet let me pose this question to you, because you to a largest extent address the problem or uphold the value that education is a public good. So but yet I would like you to address this question on how do we identify first generation learners.
So education absolutely is a public good, and that's writ large in the Open University's mission. But we also know that certain aspects of the student journey become hurdles. To go to the title of this panel, become real sticking points, moments of liminality, where students need lots of scaffold at different times for different reasons. And of course, our first generation students, who may be amongst those from the lower socioeconomic groups, they may also be from the global majority in terms of ethnicity. They may also have a disability and a mental health condition and challenge as part of that disability, and so on and so forth. So the intersectionality for us is really important for us to understand, and how that plays out at key moments of the student journey. And by way of example, a key moment of the student journey, once they've started, would be their first assessment and their second assessment, or their first end of module assessment. And for us as a distance learning organization, we tend to say things like, we teach through assessment. And there's a pulse of assessments across each of our modules that is the point of interaction with each student, with their tutor. So it's of critical importance that assessment period has the scaffolding there to accommodate our diverse learners, as I've said. Interestingly, as part of the admissions process for UK universities, and I have 2 adult children who have recently applied to go to universities, they are asked the question in the national application process, And the question isn't, are you first generation? Because they wouldn't understand that. It's, what are the highest education qualifications held by your parents or guardians? And so there's a national data set that is held from the point of application into the national system. And we also ask that question because we sit slightly outside of that system because of our nature. And we ask that question in the application process. The key thing for us then is to join up that data with an understanding of which of our learners are most at risk of not being successful, of failing that first assignment as a first point of engagement and walking away straight away. In many cases, having taken on student debt to be with us. So we have to work really hard, and that's part of our ongoing activity, to really understand what works for our students and how we can make sure that what we really are assessing isn't their ability to navigate our systems and our processes, how to submit a piece of work through this complicated platform. We're not assessing that. We're assessing their academic ability, the learning outcomes from each of our courses. So we have to take the grit out of the machine, as the saying goes, to ensure that that's as smooth as possible on the administration side, so that their focus on those key moments like assessment and receiving feedback and planning ahead for the next assessment using that feedback is what's foregrounded. Within our national regulatory landscape, and Professor Phillips also commented on this in terms of knowledge of the UK system, we have moved very much into a space where student outcomes, access, continuation, completion, and progression to graduate level jobs, all of those stages of the learner journey are measured, are tabulated, and have become a proxy for quality in the UK, well, certainly the English part of the UK regulatory framework, and there are differences in the other of the nations. And I should also point out that the OU is a 4-nation institution with students domiciled in Scotland, Wales, and the north of Ireland as part of our statute. Further complications about regulation, but for our English regulation, our access and participation plan, and we have to have one of those to continue our registration to be a university. So every university with a university title, in essence, has to have this plan that is signed off by the regulator. And we submit that. It's actually, they've just changed how we do those, but it's around every 4 years to really foreground, using our own data, which students will be at risk of not being successful in our context, and what we're going to do about that, including how much money we're going to spend to address those things. So it's a real investment in time, energy, pedagogy, student support, resources. It cuts to the heart of that question: which students are at greatest risk? And in some institutions, it may well be first-generation students. But I'm fairly sure also across the sector, so there's other aspects of intersectionality that really need a careful understanding of how that manifests at the local contextual level. So one final point, if I may, just to say the narrative politically and in some parts of our media here in the UK has shifted over the very recently. It's accelerated, but has been shifting in the present political context, where a previous famous leader of the UK would have talked up the importance of encouraging all young people to attend higher education. And there was a notional figure of 50% of young people should be aspiring to go to institution, stated by Tony Blair, remember, one of our previous prime ministers. But the current narrative is very much not that. And, universities shouldn't be for everybody. Playing through in political discourse and also some of the media. But what those citizens in the UK fail to say is, well, which young people shouldn't have that opportunity to progress to university, and also who therefore will be our future lawyers, our future doctors, our future artists, our future poets, our future teachers in the UK. Because that's what we have at risk here if we start to limit both aspirations of young people and the opportunity for young people, but then the success of young people by not evolving our institutions in such a way that we can meet the learner where they are at. And so to that end, the work we do at the OU is, of course, really important, the scale at which we do it. But I'm hoping too that many other institutions can and do adopt some of the same powerful methodologies to that same end.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Pickup. We have only 5 minutes left, but what I'll do is I'll still pose a question to you on the empowerment part. I request all the speakers to limit your response to 30 seconds. I know it's too short a time for a question like this. So when we look at empowering, or the systems which institutions will have to develop by way of supporting the first generation learners, various forces are at play. Number one, the perception that first generation learners are weak, well, that will prove to be fallacious, because as Professor Phillips mentioned, there may be individuals with extraordinary potential within that group who are intellectually absolutely bright within that group. That's one factor. Second one is, of course, there could be many psychological factors, including inhibitions, who might have moved from modest intellectual background or modest family background to higher educational institutions. Third is the motive. The motive, probably, they are there because the parent has a dream. Or it could be that, it's a family aspiration for somebody to send to higher educational institutions. So understanding the motive is an important factor in creating systems. And lastly, dreams. Many of them might have come to a higher educational institution with hopes, with dreams. So expectation management becomes a big challenge for the institution, and expectations vary from individual to individual. So each one of you, I request you to quickly respond in 30 seconds. How do we meddle with these different forces at play, or these different undercurrents at play? I'll start with Professor Phillips.
Thank you. Well, empowerment. I think that one of the things we try to do at York University is that as soon as a student is admitted, we start putting programming in front of them. We start even before they're going to start in the fall, their program of study. We give some free online modules to help them, first of all, understand what's going to be required to navigate their first year. What is available? Where can you go if you're struggling with either your personal mental health or food security or whatever it might be, or with your academics and not knowing if you're in the right place, taking the right courses, or not doing well on your first assessment, so that they have a sense before they arrive that there are places I can go if I'm finding this difficult, but also to shore up some of the academic fundamentals that might help them feel a bit more ready to be in that classroom. And so I think that starting very early and providing navigational aids. We also have an AI-driven virtual advisor that allows students to very quickly access information about where do I go for X, how do I do Y. So as many tools as possible, and starting early to empower students to take control of their success at university.
Thank you very much. Professor MALISH.
Yeah, so my last point is that how to address the issues and how to promote the learning and outcome of the students from the first generation in particular, or maybe in equity groups in general. So in banking, we used to say the know your customer. So I would say know your student. So we need to have some mechanism at the institution level to periodically collect who are our students, what are the kind of the aspirations, their pre-college credential, then everyday experience in the campus, classroom, hostels, etc. That data source should lead to some strategies. But otherwise, no, if you only think about some of the patronizing kind of providing more support, etc., without an empirical basis of what is happening in the reality, that will not lead to a quality outcome. So I suggest every institution should have a stringent mechanism to periodically collect information from the students about their social, academic experience and aspirations, etc. That should be the resource for the institutional level planning and the development of strategies to address their requirement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor SABHARWAL.
Yeah, just quickly, I think our research is suggesting that students' perceptions and feelings of how supportive, engaged, and concerned their institutions are, especially faculty members that they interact with on a regular basis, of their personal, academic, and social needs, are powerful aspects of providing that support. That has quite a direct link with developing academic competency, especially at the first year, when they are in the first year in that transition phase and in the first year of their college life. So the role of faculty members is imperative and cannot be underemphasized. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sabharwal. Professor Pickup.
Thank you. Three things. Number one, just like Professor Phillips, early engagement and that focus on pre-arrival, pre-induction and induction content, but always looking to evolve that approach. So we've just piloted in the last intake a new OU Ready program to really step that up to ensure that that has the impact that we're seeking. Number two, helping students get to the right starting point, the right level, the right course in the right space of the HE level journey. So for example, we signpost some of our application, our enrolling students to start with what we call our access course, which is just below higher education level, the first level in the UK, to help that preparation over an extended period of time. And we offer fee waivers to do that and so on. And number three, timely intervention. So how do we enable our tutors and our support team to make timely interventions with students based on their engagement and their success across the journey? And like many institutions, we use predictive analytics, and we have a bespoke platform internally that helps our tutors spot those students who need, whether it's a phone call, whether it's an email, whether it's an automated nudge in terms of their engagement, for us to step that in at the right place for the right student. And I think that level of personalization is somewhat of a holy grail for us all working with diverse learners, but is very much the spirit in which we're taking our work forward.
Thank you, Professor. We have a few questions from the audience, but I've gone through the questions. You have answered it in one way or other. So my apologies to the audience that time doesn't permit me to take up their questions, but I'm sure that they will not be disappointed having heard you. Now, where to conclude? Well, of course, I don't think it is my responsibility to take this to a logical conclusion. And if at all it is needed, the logical conclusion is that we have begun a good debate, or probably that we have added to an ongoing discourse. All the speakers spoke from the heart with a lot of grace, a lot of clarity. And I myself feel that, there is something for willing and acting now moving forward for my own institution. All the moderators always feel that, with such talented speakers, that I wish I were not the moderator of the session with the time-boundedness upon me. Thank you very much, each one of you. It was great pleasure listening to all of you, Professor Phillips, Professor MALISH, Professor Sabharwal, Professor Pickup. Time doesn't permit us to continue. Thank you very much, and have a nice reminder of the day. And audience, please stay tuned for the next session. Good evening to everybody from India.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.